They laughed when she walked in, boots dusty, binder in hand, just a janitor's granddaughter. But 10 minutes later, the entire engineering floor stood frozen, staring at an engine that finally roared to life. Not by their million-dollar experts, but by a teenage girl they mocked. What she revealed next. It didn't just fix the machine. It cracked open a buried secret this company spent over a decade trying to silence. And by the time the CEO realized who she really was, it was already too late. The bitter wind outside Stratford Industries whistled through the cracked windows like it knew the company's time was up. Once hailed as a pride of American engineering, steel, sweat, and stubbornness built into every nut and bolt, Stratford had become a ghost of its former glory, still clinging to high ideals wrapped in corporate buzzwords. The Detroit plant, now more showroom than shop floor, was buzzing not with machines but with nerves. At the center of a gleaming stage sat the future, a revolutionary hybrid engine, a 12-cylinder monster nicknamed the Titan. A project that cost more than most neighborhoods and promised to change the game, until it didn't. The unveiling was meant to restore faith in Stratford's legacy. They invited senators, investors, legacy engineers, and even the press. The room was staged like a patriotic shrine. Flags, spotlights, and motivational slogans hung beside engine blueprints. But behind the polished chrome was a dirty truth. The Titan wouldn't start. Not after diagnostics. Not after a software reboot. Not after 3 hours of red-faced engineers pacing like gamblers down to their last chip. The silence after each failed ignition grew heavier. Sweat formed on foreheads despite the icy air. Executives whispered behind clipboards. A storm was brewing, not of thunder, but of consequences, lawsuits, investor pullouts, and the final nail in a once mighty company's coffin. And as panic spread like a virus, no one noticed a janitor sweeping near the back of the hall, with a small teenage girl walking to the side door carrying an old lunchbox and a thermos. Her name was Ellie Briggs, and nobody in that crowd gave her a second glance. Just a girl, maybe 19, denim jacket too big for a frame, boots stained with axle grease, and hair tucked behind her ears like she'd rather be under a truck than in this overlit showroom. She wasn't there to network or gawk at the failed Titan. She was just dropping off lunch for her grandfather, Walt. The janitor who'd been mopping floors in that plant longer than half those engineers had been alive. Walt was a quiet man, grizzled, limping slightly from a factory accident decades back, and carried a face lined with 1,000 disappointments, but none deeper than what happened to his son, Daniel. Ellie walked with quiet purpose, weaving through crowds of power ties and polished shoes, all while clutching her thermos like it was a sacred object. She saw Walt, handed him the lunchbox, and was about to leave when a voice cut through the air like a buzzsaw. "Hey, maybe she can fix it," one of the younger VPs sneered, eyes locked on Ellie with a smirk. A few chuckles followed. Walt froze. Ellie paused. The room shifted slightly, attention pivoting like wolves scenting weakness. "That's your granddaughter, Walt?" someone asked, louder than necessary. Ellie turned slowly, looking back at the huddled group of executives and engineers, none of whom expected a response. Because girls like her weren't supposed to talk engines. She was meant to blush, stammer, maybe run. But something flickered in her eye, a stubborn glint her father used to carry. The same one that got him blacklisted. The same one that once dreamed of changing how engines breathed. And in that moment, something old and buried began to stir. The CEO, a sharp-dressed relic named Randall Knox with a smile like a sharpened blade, stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to shift the room's failing energy. He had built his career selling illusions, performance without integrity, progress without credit. "Tell you what," he said, loud enough for the press to hear. "If the janitor's granddaughter can fix what my engineers can't, I'll personally pay for her entire education." Laughter erupted like a nervous cough. Phones came out. Some staff began recording, hungry for a viral moment. But what they expected was humiliation, a clip to be shared under captions like, "Factory girl fails spectacularly." Ellie looked at her grandfather, who subtly shook his head. "Don't do this. Not here. Not with them." But Ellie had seen that shake too many times growing up. Her dad had taught her how to rebuild carburetors before she could drive, how to sketch fuel injection systems on napkins, how to listen to a machine like it had a soul. And when the system shut him out, when those blueprints he submitted were lost and later reimagined by Stratford without a trace of his name, Ellie watched a brilliant man die with his dreams still ticking inside his chest. So, she stepped forward. "Can I touch it?" she asked. Her voice didn't tremble, but her fists did. Randall grinned. "By all means, make your grandpa proud." Someone in the back snickered. But Walt wasn't proud yet. He was terrified. Because this wasn't just a prank gone corporate. This was a setup, a public execution. And he knew how this company treated threats. Ellie didn't walk like someone intimidated. She walked like someone entering a church. Slowly, deliberately, she dropped her lunchbox beside the Titan's display and opened it. Not to reveal sandwiches, but cloth-wrapped binder worn at the edges, stained with time and bound with electrical tape. Inside were hand-sketched engine diagrams and problem-solving notes, hundreds of them, each marked by the same looping initials, D.B. Daniel Briggs. Her father. Ellie flipped to a page and studied it, as if reacquainting herself with an old melody. The room around her buzzed with tension, but she was no longer in that room. She was back in the garage with her father, holding a flashlight as he explained why a valve needed to breathe like lungs. She traced a finger across a schematic and murmured, "He told me this part would crack under pressure." Then, without fanfare, she unscrewed a side panel on the Titan, slipped her arm deep into its housing, and removed a small, jagged component. It was a rotary valve, cracked clean through, the kind of hairline fault no diagnostic software would catch, but a mechanic who listened, who knew how machines fail like people. She'd see it immediately. From her backpack, she pulled out a handmade replacement, machined in her father's barn workshop years ago, and installed it with practiced care. The crowd was silent. Breath held. Walt clutched his mop, so tight the wood creaked. Ellie stood up, wiped her hands on her jeans, and said quietly, "Try it now." A technician hesitated. Randall scoffed. But someone pressed the ignition anyway. The Titan purred to life. Smooth, rich, effortless. The silence that followed wasn't just disbelief. It was fear. Because something just happened they couldn't explain. And now they'd have to. As the Titan's engine roared to life, lighting up the room with raw mechanical glory, the engineers were the last to clap. They stood frozen, staring at Ellie not like she was a prodigy, but like she was a ghost. One of them leaned to another and whispered, "That fix, it wasn't the spec sheets." Another replied, "Because it was never part of our design." Ellie reached for her binder and flipped to another page, revealing a 10-year-old sketch, nearly identical to the engine before them, but with her father's annotations in the margins. Warning: over-torque risk on central rotary valve. Needs composite reinforcement. It wasn't plagiarism. It was prophecy. "Where did you get that?" a senior engineer demanded. "From my father," Ellie said. "Daniel Briggs." Randall's smile vanished like a coin flipped on its bad side. The name hit the room like a drop wrench on concrete. They all knew it. The guy who was laughed out of Stratford for presenting incomplete designs. The man they said lacked a vision to lead innovation. They'd buried him with committee meetings, sealed rooms, and PR language. And now here was his daughter, fixing what they couldn't. Not with credentials, not with code, but with memory, heart, and an inheritance of brilliance no boardroom could silence. Walt stepped forward then, not with pride, but with a crusty pain in his throat. "She's not just some kid," he muttered. "She's Daniel's revenge." But Ellie didn't come for revenge. She came for the truth. And now that the engine was running, it wasn't just combustion. It was reckoning. Everyone in that room knew it. They had missed what she saw because they never thought to look beyond the data. They never thought a girl in boots with a binder full of grease-stained drawings would be the one to bring their empire to its knees. But that's the thing about legacy. It doesn't come with credentials. It comes with blood, pain, and the kind of knowledge earned, not bought. As the Titan's engine sang its flawless mechanical symphony, the sound echoed to the steel walls with a kind of defiance, like it was shouting down years of arrogance. But the real power in that room wasn't coming from the pistons. It was radiating from Ellie Briggs, who just stood there quietly, sleeves stained with oil, watching these men in $300 slacks stare at her like they'd seen a ghost from their own past. The applause didn't come all at once. It started with one slow, stunned clap from a young tech near the back who didn't fully understand what he'd just witnessed, but he felt it. Then another, then silence again. The engineers didn't clap. The executives certainly didn't. Randall Knox stood frozen, jaw clenched so tight the skin on his temples pulsed. Because he didn't see a lucky guess. He saw a threat. A teenage girl had walked into his sanctum, fixed a machine no $1 million salary could solve, and in doing so, called every expert's competence into question. Ellie didn't smile. She didn't preen. She just turned and began to pack up her binder and tools like a farmhand at the end of a long day. And that's when the question started. Where did you learn this? What design is that? Who trained you? She didn't answer. Not yet, because she knew what came next wasn't about gears and gaskets. It was about history. Her fathers, her grandfathers, and every forgotten mechanic who ever got buried by a handshake deal in a locked boardroom. She didn't need to say anything. The Titan was still running, and that sound alone had shattered their illusion of superiority. It started as a whisper. An older engineer in the back, hair silver and eyes sunken with years of looking the other way, murmured the name, Daniel Briggs. The moment it left his lips, half the room turned toward him, while the other half tried to pretend they hadn't heard it. But it was too late. Ellie turned, slow and steady, holding up her father's binder like a relic from a forgotten religion. These are his designs, she said. 10 years before you built this engine, my father sketched it on a plywood workbench in our barn. She flipped to the schematic again. Several engineers squinted. One audibly gasped. It was nearly identical to the Titan's core module, but dated, signed, and filled with original annotations. Another engineer spoke up, his voice cracking. I remember him. He pitched something like this, 12 years ago? They said he was too unpolished, too old school. Another nodded, a painful look in his eyes. We were told it was junk. Ellie's voice sharpened, though it never rose. And months later, your company filed a new patent, one that looked a lot like his. She looked directly at Knox, whose jaw had shifted from stunned silence to something more predatory. He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room had just realized they were either complicit, ignorant, or part of the theft. And worst of all, they knew the engine they built wasn't even theirs. It belonged to a dead man who once stood in this very room, laughed out, dismissed, and left to rot. And now his daughter had brought him back, not in vengeance, but in vindication. The air thickened as Ellie opened the second folder inside her lunchbox. It was a flash drive, a weathered copy of her father's journal entries, audio clips, scan notes, emails sent to Stratford's patent team that were never answered. She held it up like a dagger made of truth. This contains everything, she said. Proof that this engine, your engine, started with my father's pencil and his pain. Randall took a step forward, tried to regain control of the room with his trademark confidence, but it cracked when he spoke. Even if your father submitted something similar, it doesn't prove intent. The tech world evolves. Ideas overlap. It's not theft. It's progress. His voice sounded hollow, even to himself. Ellie didn't flinch. He died thinking he wasn't good enough, she said, eyes locked on a man who mocked her minutes earlier. I buried him with his notebook, but I kept his voice. And now you get to hear it. She tapped her phone and a clip played to the speaker. Her father, tired but determined, saying, if they won't take a design, maybe one day Ellie will. She's got better hands than I ever had. The room fell silent. Raw, shattering silence. It wasn't data or charts. It was grief. The kind you can't refute with spreadsheets. Randall stepped back, unsure the ground under him was still safe. Because now the question wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about fixing a legacy that this company had broken, buried, and forgotten. The engineers began whispering not just to each other, but to themselves. Their memories. The times they overheard quiet arguments, designs that suddenly disappeared, co-workers who were transferred after asking too many questions. One technician leaned toward a colleague and muttered, I remember seeing a printout like that in a locked file years ago. I thought it was a test file. A project manager recalled a time when they were told to shred redundant drafts. Another remembered Daniel Briggs' name being scrubbed from a shared drive, then conveniently never mentioned again. It wasn't one thief. It was a culture of silence, of gatekeeping disguised as genius, of boardroom sharks preying on small-town minds. Randall saw it unraveling in real time. He raised his voice, desperate to sound authoritative again. We build as a team here. Sometimes ideas come from unexpected places. But let's not pretend one drawing from a decade ago built this engine. But it was too late. A veteran engineer stepped forward, a quiet man named Sam who had retired and returned to consult on Titan. He held up a tattered folder. I kept copies, he said. I didn't know what they meant, not until today. He handed them to Ellie. Inside were 3 pages, an internal memo from years ago referencing Daniel Briggs' design submission, marked for reassignment. The initials of the VP on the document matched the man, now turning pale near the media booth. Ellie didn't look victorious. She looked tired. Tired of proving what should have been obvious. Her father was brilliant, and now the whole room had to face it, not with applause, but with shame. As panic settled in, corporate reflexes kicked in like a machine, catching fire. The VP who laughed at Ellie began ordering security to remove her. She's not an employee, he barked. She's accessing proprietary material without clearance. But no one moved. The security team looked at each other, unsure. One even took a step back. Ellie stood her ground, binder in one hand, flash drive in the other. Try it, she said. I'm already streaming this live. Randall's eyes snapped toward a nearby monitor. There, in crystal clarity, was his face mocking Ellie, followed by the Titan sudden startup, and now, this confrontation. Thousands were watching, some cheering, others stunned, but all listening. Shut it down, Randall snapped. All feeds, cut them off. But it was no use. You can't plug a leak that's already in the bloodstream. And this wasn't a scandal. It was a reckoning. The media outside had already picked it up. Screens flashed with headlines. Factory girl outsmarts corporate giants. Stolen genius? Briggs' engine mystery unfolds. Still, Randall made one last lunge for power. He pointed at Ellie and snarled, You think anyone will believe a mechanic's kid over us? Ellie just stared back, calm as thunder. They won't believe me, she said. They'll believe my father. And they'll believe what your own files show. And that was it. The moment Stratford lost control, not just of a narrative, but of an empire built on silence. In a single afternoon, the lie that built their legacy had been disassembled by the very blood it tried to erase. And from that silence, something louder than an engine's roar began to rise, truth. The walls inside Stratford didn't crumble from protest or fire. They cracked from the weight of conscience. One by one, the men and women who had buried their doubts for years began to speak. It started with Leonard, a senior systems engineer with 35 years at the company and a limp from an old prototype test gone wrong. He stepped forward with eyes that didn't meet Ellie's. I saw it, he said, barely a whisper. I saw your father's diagrams. I knew they were his. But I didn't speak up. I had a mortgage, kids in college, and I told myself, it's not my fight. His voice broke. That's how they get us. They count on good men staying quiet. He pulled his badge from his lanyard and dropped it on the floor with a hollow clack. Others followed. Dana, a middle manager in quality control, confessed to watching Daniel's access be revoked after his design pitch. A machinist admitted he'd once rebuilt one of Daniel's early engines and knew it had potential, knew it. But no one wanted to go against corporate. No one wanted to risk the job that fed their family. Ellie didn't judge them. She listened. Her silence wasn't passive. It was power. Because every confession added weight to the truth. It wasn't just one man's word anymore. It was a chorus of regrets, a factory floor full of second chances. And that was something bigger than revenge. That was restoration. She stood in the center of the room now, not as a girl with a grudge, but as a woman carrying legacy in her hands like a torch. The media had shown up. Cameras flashed. Microphones extended. The corporate board began whispering about PR containment. But Ellie wasn't interested in their apologies. She didn't want hush money. She didn't want a scholarship anymore. She wanted justice. not just for her father, but for every brilliant voice that had been silenced by gatekeepers in suits. "I'm not here to destroy Stratford," she said, looking Randall dead in the eye. "I'm here to rebuild what you broke. I want his name on this engine. I want every student in this country who builds in barns and garages to know they belong. And I want a program that protects them, so what happened to my father never happens again." The board looked around nervously. This was a negotiation. It was a reckoning. The demand didn't come from entitlement. It came from a wound that had been cauterized by grit. And somehow, the crowd knew this wasn't just about an engine. This was about every unheard voice, every passed-over resume, every invention stolen behind closed doors. Ellie Briggs wasn't just a symbol now. She was a standard, unnoticed by most. A man in a brown overcoat had been standing in the back of the room the entire time, jotting in a notebook with slow, deliberate strokes. His name was Calvin Rohr, a field agent with the Department of Scientific Ethics, one of the newer divisions formed after the last major whistleblower scandal shook Washington. He stepped forward, showed his credentials, and the room snapped to attention. Even Randall paled. Calvin didn't need a mic. His voice was calm, clipped, surgical. "We've had our eye on